Okay, everyone, today we're looking at the respiratory system for our GCSE PE revision, particularly looking at Edexcel PE, the GCSE paper that is. So, when we look at the papers, questions tend to be broken down into these main areas: composition of air, gas exchange, lung volumes, breathing rates, lung structures, and sometimes linked into that is the aerobic versus anaerobic sort of impacts. Now, the ones that tend to get asked the most are composition of air and gas exchange. The lung volumes, breathing rates, lung structure, they tend to be quite a bit smaller and rarer. So let's get into it. So the composition of air can be asked in a different way. So you might be shown a picture like this on the screen and ask questions about it. For example, it might ask you why does the values change between inhaled and exhaled air. It might have a bit missing, for example. It might miss the number out here or oxygen out there and say, label it as an A and say what is point A. So I would suggest really strongly that you learn particularly the values for oxygen and carbon dioxide for both inhaled and exhaled air. Now, we need to look at sort of why the values are different or they change between inhaled and exhaled. So the types of analysis that you'll be breaking it down to is saying the very basics of what you see. So why are these numbers different? Well, there's more oxygen inhaled and there's more carbon dioxide exhaled, and that's just the key point that you want to be making. You want to be making the point that, and these are all very similar sort of analysis points, oxygen levels decrease when exhaling by about 5%. CO2 levels increase when exhaling, and you can give the numbers 0.04 to 4%. So all we're saying is that more O2 is inhaled, more CO2 is exhaled. We breathe in 21% oxygen, but breathe out 16%. It's the same thing. And breathe out 4% of CO2, but breathe in 0.04. So these are just different ways of saying the same thing. It comes up quite regularly, and just being able to say those basic points of we breathe in more oxygen and we breathe out more CO2. That's basically what we were saying in these points. Now, when we're talking about it, why is this happening? Well, we all know by now that oxygen is used for aerobic respiration to generate energy. CO2 is a waste product that is generated during aerobic respiration by our muscles, and it therefore needs to be removed. And both of those processes are done so we can delay our fatigue. And if we can delay fatigue, we can work for harder, for longer. And if you've watched these videos before, you will know I repeat those sort of phrases regularly when we're talking about the impact on performance. Oxygen energy makes us delay fatigue, and we can work for harder, for longer. We can run faster for longer periods of time. We can cycle longer. Those sort of points that we want to be making in terms of application. When we're talking about gas exchange, there's two sites that the exam question might ask you about gas exchange, and they may show you pictures like these. These are example pictures I've taken, and one is at the lungs, and you can see that oxygen is coming from the structure. In this case, it's the alveoli into the bloodstream, and carbon dioxide is going from the bloodstream into the alveoli in this structure. Now, this question here tends to be stuck in there as a one to catch people out, and in this picture you can see that oxygen is leaving the bloodstream and going into whatever this structure is, and carbon dioxide is leaving this structure here and going into the bloodstream. Now, that's happening at the muscles. So but many students tend to put, because they see this picture, they tend to just assume it's happening at the lungs. It's not, and if it comes up, don't be fooled by it. It's happening at the muscles. So the question I've put on board is always think, where is this taking place and which direction are the gases moving? So if the oxygen is essentially going into the bloodstream, it's at the lungs. If the oxygen is leaving the bloodstream, it's at the muscles. So just try and remember that way, and then carbon dioxide will be the alternates of that. Now, why and the importance of it? Why does that happen? Well, we need oxygen for energy. We've talked about this many a time now. Oxygen is diffused into the red blood cells, into the bloodstream, and it's needed for energy at the working muscles, and we do that to sustain our exercise. We need to remove carbon dioxide, okay, and therefore we breathe it out. And the key thing in that sense is that we don't really want for long distance events, particularly anaerobic energy. We want aerobic energy. So the process of how it happens. Now, one of the key things you might want to write is something along the lines of a diffusion gradient. Now, a diffusion gradient is where the concentration of oxygen will move from a high to low direction. So in the alveoli, you've got a high concentration of oxygen, and the capillaries around the alveoli, you've got a low concentration of oxygen. So the oxygen will always go from the alveoli in the lungs to the capillaries in the around the alveoli, which is going from high concentration to a lower concentration. We have thin walls of the alveoli and thin walls of the capillaries that surround the alveoli, which means there is a easier diffusion rate. It's a quicker diffusion rate because it only has to go through one cell. And then our oxygen is transported to the muscles, and as we say before, it allows us to recover, it helps us to delay fatigue, helps us to work for longer and for at harder rates. So this is generally the types of questions you'll be faced with. So where it takes place, why, and what's the importance of it, and then how it takes place. And here's an exam question scenario that you may see. And if you're looking at this screen here, you've got a table here, and this is the exam question. It says, which one of the following is the most likely level of oxygen in the blood before and after gas exchange at the muscle during exercise? Very long-winded question. It's trying to confuse you a little bit, but let's look at this sense here. So oxygen level before gas exchange, oxygen level after gas exchange. And in this case, it's high and high, which we know we can't have because there's always going to be a diffusion gradient. So number one, A cannot really exist. High gas exchange, high oxygen levels before gas exchange, and the question is oxygen in the blood, and it says before gas exchange at the muscle. So high amount of gas exchange in the blood, and after gas exchange, the oxygen has left the blood and gone into the muscle. We've got a low amount of oxygen, which is the correct answer. So it's trying to break down these questions and knowing what we're looking for in terms of the concentrations of oxygen. So before exercise or gas exchange has taken place, we have the high levels of wherever it is. It might be the alveoli or in the blood, and then it goes. Once it's used up, it becomes lower. Right, another type of question you'll face is lung volumes. So the first sort of areas that you need to define in lung volumes are vital capacity and tidal volume. Now, more often you will get asked to either multiple choice tick the right answers or write them out. And vital capacity is the maximum amount of air you can breathe in and out in one breath. Okay. And then the next one is tidal volume, which is the amount of air we breathe in and out normally, now in our normal breathing rates. So these are types of exam questions, and just probably multiple choice, just tick the right definition, or it will give you the definition and ask you to tick the right phrase. So learn these two, vital capacity and tidal volume. Make sure you do know them. And just remember that tidal volume is the normal breathing rates that go up and down. Now, what is the impact that exercise has on this tidal volume? Well, we know that oxygen is increased, the demand for oxygen is increased when we start exercising, that we need to remove carbon dioxide, and we need energy in our muscles. So what happens is our tidal volume rate and depth increases. So these lines will get up close together and slightly larger because that's the rate and the depth. and therefore tidal volume increases. And that's a type of question that you may well face. And this is sort of an exam question that has looked at the spirometer trace, and this is at rest, and this point is during exercise. And what you can see is the difference between the two graphs. So if you think tidal volume as normal breathing rate here, and at exercise, these peaks and troughs go a lot higher and a lot lower, and they're a lot more closer together. So when we start exercising, our breathing rate increases, which means the lines get closer together because they're more rapidly happening, the breaths, and the depth increases, and therefore the lines are increasing in size. So an exam question may ask, it might show you these two images and say, what is the impact of exercise on tidal volume? And how do you know it's happening? Because you're able to describe the lines. This is a relatively easy question that you might get asked. It might be a labeling question, it might be a multiple choice question, but just knowing what structures are inside the lung. So we have coming down here the trachea, but then more importantly we have the bronchi, then the bronchioles, which are the branches off of the bronchi, the two bronchi that come out here into each lung, and then the alveoli, the small air sacs in the lungs. Now they've seen exam questions like this saying what structures are in the lungs. It might also then in a multiple choice give you the diaphragm, but remember that's outside of the lungs. It's still a muscle used in breathing, but it's on the outside of the lungs. So just see if you get an exam question on that. Just make sure you know the basics on the structure of the lungs. And then finally we go to this sort of aerobic and anaerobic differences. If we were looking at what aerobic is, make sure you know that it involves using oxygen to create energy, and anaerobic is where we don't use oxygen to create energy. So the two definitions, sports that use oxygen and sports that don't use oxygen. Now previously in exam questions they have asked about anaerobic. They haven't really asked about aerobic in this scenario. So the example they gave in previous ones is, how do we know the sprinter is using an anaerobic energy system? And the first things we might want to talk about is oxygen needed for their energy production? And in this sense of a sprinter, no, oxygen is not needed. And why? Because there is not enough time to produce energy aerobically. It only lasts for less than 10 seconds, a sprint, or 10 seconds. So by the time energy is started to be produced aerobically, the race is over. So you don't have enough time to produce energy aerobically. It uses the phosphocreatine system, which is an A-level thing. You don't need to know about it in GCSE, but that doesn't use aerobic energy system to generate energy. And the types of muscles think about the types of muscles might be used. In this sense, it's type 2X, fast twitch muscle fibers, and they don't use oxygen. It's a short race, they don't need oxygen. Now, those sort of exam questions come up before, breaking down and analysing the sprinter. They haven't asked the flip side for a distance runner, a marathon runner, for example. And if we just take those sort of middle sort of questions, you can just reverse them. So is oxygen needed for energy? Yes, it is in the marathon. We use more fats to get energy, and we use respiration, aerobic respiration. Do they have time to generate energy aerobically? Yes, because it's lasting over 90 seconds. It's going a longer time, so therefore aerobic energy has enough time to be generated. And the muscle fiber types in a marathon tends to be type 1, slow twitch muscle fibers, that rely heavily on oxygen for their energy sources. So obviously that's where this athlete would be more aerobic energy system. And because it's a long race. So if you take the opposites of those two, and if the exam question comes up about the sprinter, you're going on this side, and if the exam question comes up about a marathon runner, you're going on this side. And finally, I've just got a mark scheme here. You can pause if you want to and go through it. And this is breaking down a 9-mark exam question, looking at the respiratory system in tennis. And the exam question wants to know, analyze the importance of the analyze the importance of the respiratory system in tennis, and it gives you 3 scenarios: a serve, a rally, and in resting. Now, AO1, which is the facts and definitions, you would just talk about what the the respiratory system actually does. Then you would go into AO2, scenarios, examples of how the respiratory system works in those scenarios. And then the evaluation, how important it is in those scenarios. So you could pause the screen and have a look through that in your own time. But it's worth breaking down these 9-mark exam questions. It might not be this type of exam question in it, but the structure could well easily be applied to the cardiovascular system. It could be applied to muscle fiber types, using the same sort of scenarios of 3 different phases of play in a sport. So get used to looking at those exam questions and breaking them down. Right, good luck revising, and I will see you maybe in another video.